Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, checking out the new album from Mac Miller, Balloonerism. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So Mac Miller's 7th studio album was released on January 17th. This is actually the second album that's been released since his death in 2018. And this was all recorded in 2013 and I think primarily 2014. It was all right around the same time he was working on the Faces mixtape, which I think is kind of widely seen as one of the best releases he ever did. I think it hit number 2 or number 3 on the Billboard 200. And it was recorded in a very dark period in Mac's life and really comes through in the lyrics on this album. So musically, this new album is a hip-hop album with some very avant-garde, psychedelic, almost neo-soul, jazz, funk kind of influences on the album. And it's a pretty long album also. It's 14 tracks across almost an hour's worth of music. And there are a couple of the tracks, one track in particular, it's 12 minutes long on this album. So if you've never listened to any Mac's music before, this is probably not the best album to start with. I would either go back and listen to, I think, Swimming and Watching Movies with the Sound Off are probably two, I think, better representations of the brilliance of Mac Miller's music. You can also go back and listen to or watch the NPR Tiny Desk concert. I think any of those three are, I think, a better starting point than this album. So Balloonerism has been floating around on the internet since 2014. There's been parts of this that have been leaked. There's been unofficial presses of this album on vinyl. It's been out there, but this is the first time you're getting the full release of this album. And I will say the production on this album, it sounds a lot better than any of those unofficial releases. So while I think Mac would have been very proud of this release, after listening to it a couple of times, I think I understand why, it took 10 plus years to get this released. It's very dark. There's some very, I think Mac was going through a really difficult time. There's a lot of isolation on this album. There's a lot of discussion about drug use, depression. It's a very dark album if you don't really know the context around Mac's life around that time. And from what I understand, Mac decided to shelve this project just because he wanted to kind of go off and focus on other things around that time. And overall, it might be his most introspective album. I don't think Mac has ever kind of delved this deep into the dark parts of his life like he did on these songs. Because like I said, there's a lot of recurring themes of addiction, of depression on this album. And it really doesn't try to hide any of that on this album. There's even a line in the song Shangri-La where he says, "If I die young, promise to smile at my funeral." It's that kind of depth and darkness that you see across this album. Another thing I really noticed listening across this album is it sounds very much it sounds like Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, which is one of my favorite rap albums of the last, probably 20 years. And it has those recurring, I think because this really does have this soul, jazz, funk kind of vibe across a lot of the songs, where To Pimp a Butterfly also kind of had that feel. And musically, it's a very unique album. It's haunting at times. It's very avant-garde. It's very psychedelic at times also. I'm not sure how much of this music was put together before Mac's death, but it definitely has its fingerprints across this album. A lot of these posthumous albums, that when you get them and listen to them, they sound almost separate from what the artist had done prior. This sounds very much like a Mac Miller album. The album starts off with the song Tambourine Dream, which, just kind of looking at it from the surface, is kind of an odd choice to start an album off because it's 33 seconds long. It's nothing but tambourine, but it kind of fits in with this whole avant-garde feel of the album. And I talk a lot about track listing and track sequencing and how you really want the first song to set the tone for the album. And while musically this doesn't really do that, but it does kind of, like I said, fits in with that avant-garde, abstract feel that the album's going to have. And then following that up is DJ's Chord Organ, which is the only song on this album that has a feature. It features SZA on here, and she's actually more involved lyrically on this song than Mac is. It opens with a 2-minute and 40-second long organ intro, and actually the DJ in the title is a reference to Daniel Johnston, who unfortunately passed in 2019. A great singer-songwriter. He's got some really interesting music going back to the early part of the 80s. And he did a lot of these like lo-fi homemade cassette recordings. This cassette from 1983 is called Hi, How Are Ya? It's available on streaming services. I recommend going back and checking it out. It's very avant-garde. It's very lo-fi. It sounds like just somebody recording something in their bedroom, but there's some great tracks on there. But DJ's chord organ is a reference to Daniel Johnston because Mac uses his chord organ in the song. And there's this neo-soul jazz vibe across a lot of the album, especially in the first single off the album, which was $5 Pony Rides. It's one of my favorite tracks off this album, and it's got this great, like, jazzy kind of vibe through a lot of the song. And then there's a song like Mrs. Deborah Downer, which is kind of prophetic and foretells a lot of the circumstances around Mac's death, unfortunately, 4 years after its recording. Funny Papers is one of my favorite tracks on this album. It starts out with this great piano intro and then kind of slides into this more like laid back, jazzy kind of beat. And it's just, I think it's one of Mac's best songs he's ever written. Another one of my favorite tracks on this album is Rick's Piano. I think it's kind of the outlier lyrically on this album because it is a wildly optimistic song, but it does have a great backstory. So back in 2014, Mac was on a flight on his way to Europe, called Rick Rubin. He was drunk. He asked Rick to help him get clean and sober, and he spent like the whole summer of 2014 in Malibu with Rick Rubin. And it was during those sessions in Malibu that he recorded the song, and unfortunately, his sobriety didn't last too long. And then he closes the album out with the song Tomorrow We'll Never Know. And this has been kind of a controversial song because there's a lot of people out there that don't like ending the album with this song because it is probably the most abstract and avant-garde song on this album. The song has this almost like light and airy, dreamy-like music that kind of flows through it. And the music is contrasted by some very dark and heavy lyrics. I think it is the perfect match to end the album with. Kind of bookends it with that opening tambourine track. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't like the song because it is long. It's 12 minutes long. It's by far the longest track on this album. I think it's one of the longest tracks in his career. So over the years, there's been a ton of posthumous albums released. I think Tupac has released more albums since his death than when he was alive. But I think it's really rare that you get a posthumous album like this that is so intimate and so immersive. And it's also kind of rare that the posthumous album lives up to the hype. This, like I said, this is an album that has been talked about and discussed and partially listened to for, over 10 years. And I'm glad that it really lives up to the hype that it has. Like I said before, though, if you're not a big Mac Miller fan or you've never really listened to any of his music, I don't think this is a really good album to start with. Go back and listen to some of his earlier stuff. Then if you like that, come back and listen to this album because I think you'll really enjoy it then. So some of my favorite tracks on here: Stoned, Rick's Piano, which I already talked about, DJ's Chord Organ, Shangri-La is a great track, Funny Papers is a great track, Mannequins is another one of my favorites. When it comes to like skippable tracks, I think it's really kind of hard to pick one. I think Transformation is probably the closest to a skippable track on this album. And I say it's really kind of hard to pick a skippable track because even the tracks that aren't great on this album are kind of fascinating to listen to. Unfortunately, I didn't become a fan of Mac Miller's music until after his death in 2018. And as I've gone back and dug through his career, there's so many brilliant albums and so many brilliant tracks. It's really a shame that we lost him as early as we did. And musically, I think I would put this up there with some of the best albums of his career. And overall, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd give this an 8.5. It's an album where I can kind of see maybe it growing on me even a little bit more. By the end of the year, I can see this ending up in my top 10 of the year. And because a lot of times these posthumous albums don't really live up to the hype, I decided not to pre-order this one. After listening to it a few times, I already bought it, but I kind of had a hard time tracking down a copy of it. So there's a couple different versions of this. Of course, it's available on black vinyl. It's also there's an Amazon exclusive that's on green vinyl. There's an indie exclusive that's on white. I think if you go on his website, there's a clear version also. I had a hard time finding a lot of those. A couple of my local stores have been completely sold out. And I'm recording this the day after the album came out, which is kind of surprising. I did find a copy that I'm going to have to drive quite a ways to go pick up tomorrow, but I definitely will have this one on vinyl. And then there's also a super deluxe version of this album, which musically doesn't come with anything different, but does have like this big pop-out 3D jacket. Really kind of cool presentation, but I think it was the list price on it was like $150, which is way out of my price range for an album like this, but I'm glad to have at least a standard copy of it. And this is one of those albums where I think if you're not a big hip hop fan, I think you can still really enjoy this album. Like I said, it's got some big like neo soul influences on here, some jazz influences, very avant-garde, very psychedelic kind of album. So it's definitely one worth checking out. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. I'd love to know what you guys think of this. Have you guys checked out Balloonerism yet? Are you planning to? Have you listened to any of other Max albums? Like I said, I've got, I think the only one I've got on vinyl is Swimming, which is a great album. I do want to pick up Circles. There are a couple other ones across his career I want to grab, but let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.